God bless America. Hello, everybody. I am the Talk Radio Protege. This is the Protege program. Thank you so much for joining me. Yesterday was the first casualty of my schedule getting busier. I wanted to talk about Zuckerberg's testimony before Congress, and I just didn't have time to do the research that you all deserved for a video covering a topic like this. But we're going to talk about it today. I'm going to go through and hit the highlights, that what I think was important to observe from this testimony. I would highly encourage you to go and watch the testimony yourself and find other people that are commenting on this testimony as well, because I couldn't possibly cover everything in a single video in the format that I'm currently using. So I want to begin with the opening statement that Zuckerberg delivered to the Senate. We'll skip past the platitudes and we'll get straight to what is important from this statement. Zuckerberg said, "It's clear now that we didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. And that goes for fake news, for foreign interference in elections and hate speech, as well as developers and data privacy. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here. So now we have to go through all of our relationship with people and make sure we're taking a broad enough view of our responsibility." Here we get to the first interesting line, in my opinion. It's not enough to just connect people. We have to make sure that those connections are positive. It's not enough to just give people a voice. Now, Zuckerberg believes that negative interpersonal connections on Facebook should be policed. I want you to think about that. It's not enough to just connect people. We have to make sure that those connections are positive, Zuckerberg said to the Senate. His belief is that negative interpersonal connections either have no place on Facebook or must be policed. And that is a dangerous, I think, thing to say. If you're going to say that people must have positive connections on Facebook, now people are no longer allowed to have any interactions with people that are negative. Now, if people aren't having a good time on Facebook, it's a bad thing. We need to make sure that people aren't using it to harm other people or to spread misinformation. Now, this statement is interesting, not because of, you think about what normal people mean when they say harm or misinformation. What normal people mean when they say harm or misinformation is out-and-out lies or actually hurting someone, physically causing injury to someone. But because of the rhetoric of the left and the work that they've done to muddy the waters around concepts like violence and the truth, it's a murky statement to say we need to make sure people aren't using our platform to hurt others, or to say that we need to make sure people aren't using our platform to spread misinformation. Because to the left, something that disagrees with their point is totally false. If you don't agree that if you don't agree that there are more than two genders, you're spreading misinformation, according to the current progressive left. And it's worrisome to see that somebody with a left-leaning bias like Mark Zuckerberg is using words like this. Harm is something else that the concept of harm has been incredibly damaged by the left and the SJWs, especially when they conflate words with violence. It doesn't matter how mean a person is when they call you a fat, lazy slob. Calling you a fat, lazy slob is not the same as shooting you in the groin with a .22 pistol. It's just not. Sure, it might hurt your feelings, but it doesn't cause you any bodily harm. It's like the saying used to go that we used to teach kids in school. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words cannot hurt you. Words and words alone cannot hurt you. I talk about this a little bit in my upcoming project that I hope you all are eagerly anticipating as much as I am. But sometimes words have a physical force behind them, but it's in very limited context. Contextually, some words might have physical force lodged behind them. For instance, in the era of feudalism, whenever a king might say, "Cut that man's head off," and his soldiers would go and they would cut that man's head off. Those words are dangerous, but there's no longer really in the West anybody that has that kind of power. I can't think of, off the top of my head, anybody in the West that has the power to say, "Kill that man," and it will be done instantly. We still have the rule of law in this country. Now, I don't think that it's meant directly the way that it reads here. But the next sentence, "It's not enough just to give people control over their information." I instantly read that as, we need to police the information that people have control over. But the next line says, we need to make sure that the developers they share it with protect their information too. So maybe he's talking about personal information, but just the way that I read that sentence, it sent a chill down my back, you might say. Across the board, we have a responsibility to not just build tools, but to make sure they're used for good. Okay. This is an interesting one, because this says to me that Zuckerberg believes that entrepreneurs, creators, inventors, people that are making a tool or a service are partially liable for how their creations are used. Zuckerberg believes that he is responsible for how people use Facebook. If Zuckerberg believes that if terrorist propaganda or violence or racism is propagated on Facebook, that Zuckerberg is responsible, because he feels responsible to make sure that his tool, Facebook, is used for good. And he names Cambridge Analytica as an example, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit more as we go through the rest of these opening statements. First, we're getting to the bottom of exactly what Cambridge Analytica did and telling everyone affected what we know now as Cambridge Analytica improperly accessed some information about millions of Facebook members by buying it from an app developer. Now, I'm not an expert in Facebook's end-user license agreement or anything like that, but as far as I know, Facebook is selling rights to your private information in the form of selling your information to advertisers so that they can market ads toward you. So it's okay for Facebook to sell my information to advertisers so they can make ads that appeal to me, but it's not okay for a third party, or I guess a fourth party, to buy information from an ad organization or from an app or whatever so that they can market an ad towards me. They have to buy it from Facebook. If I understand this correctly, that's what's going on here. This was information that people generally share publicly on their Facebook pages. Now, if you've shared information publicly and anybody can go get it, I don't understand how Zuckerberg thinks he's liable for people getting your public now information. It's kind of like, I recall the advice that my parents gave me when it came to using the internet for the first time. And that was that once you put it on the internet, it's out there for the world to see, and you can't take it back. If people would just act like that, like they thought that everyone in the world could see their information and that they could never get rid of it, I don't think people would have as much problem with what we're dealing with Facebook right now. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about from his opening statement is this line right here. We already made big changes to our platform in 2012 that would have prevented this specific situation with Cambridge Analytica from occurring again today. Now, I don't have all the details on the Cambridge Analytica situation. I believe that Zuckerberg makes some comments about it in his testimony, but Analytica used the information in 2016. Why shouldn't the 2014 changes that you made to the platform have stopped that? Apparently it wasn't stopped. So anyways, that's all that I have to say about the opening statements. I've already spent 10 minutes, so I better get a move on if I want to make it through the rest of this. As you can see, I have not copied and pasted everything into here. I've only copied and pasted some of the things that I wanted to talk about, so there is some content missing here. I would encourage you to go again and either listen to the whole thing, read the whole thing. There's transcripts available for free online if you choose to go find them. Now, John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, is about to ask Zuckerberg about hate speech. He says, can you discuss what steps Facebook currently takes in making hate speech evaluations? And Zuckerberg says, from the beginning of the company, we had to enforce our content policies reactively. And I think that's the correct thing to do. If somebody, we don't proactively enforce the law in the United States of America. You're innocent until you do something wrong, and then you're a criminal. And even then it has to be proven that you did something wrong. And what Zuckerberg is opining about here is the way that they used to do things. Somebody would take offense to something that was on Facebook, they would flag it, and it would be reviewed. And that was enforcing our content policies reactively. Now, think about what Zuckerberg wants the user experience of Facebook to be. He said earlier that it's not enough for people just to be connected. Facebook has to ensure that those connections, those interpersonal relationships are positive. So if you get offended because of an interpersonal relationship that you had on Facebook, Zuckerberg now finds himself or feels himself to be personally responsible. So he has to make sure that your interpersonal relationship is never negative, which means he's going to have to proactively police his platform, which means it has to be better than reactively policed. And this is dangerous because I think I captured the statement a little bit later. I believe it was Ben Sass that made the statement, adults need to be able to have tough conversations, and Facebook is one of the ways to do that. And if Facebook is going to stop people from having these tough conversations, they're not going to be had to the degree that they're being had right now. Let us move on now to an exchange by Senator Ted Cruz with Mark Zuckerberg. I would encourage you to go watch this whole thing. We're not going to see it all. I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights. Now, something interesting here from the Ted Cruz exchange makes me think that Zuckerberg was coached heavily about this interview. The first indication to me that Zuckerberg was coached heavily is the way that he addresses everybody in the room. Now, I'm a redneck, and I don't call everybody Mr. or Sir or Mrs. or Miss or Ma'am when I'm speaking to them. I just don't do that. Maybe in Silicon Valley they do that differently. Everybody calls each other by their proper titles and everything. But Zuckerberg says to everybody, with every response, including the ones that are very short responses, he leads with their title and then responds. And this section in addition indicates that to me because Zuckerberg avoids like the plague the phrases that Ted Cruz introduces in this dialogue. Zuckerberg, does Facebook consider itself a neutral public forum? Senator, we consider ourselves to be a platform for all ideas. That phrase, platform for all ideas, gets repeated a lot in this testimony. Cruz, let me ask the question again. Does Facebook consider itself to be a neutral public forum? Are you a First Amendment speaker expressing your views, or are you a neutral public forum allowing everyone to speak? Zuckerberg, here's how we think about this. I don't believe that there are certain content that clearly we do not allow, right? Hate speech, terrorist content, nudity, anything that makes people feel unsafe in the community. That goes back, that highlighted part right there goes back to Zuckerberg's attitude about Facebook, that Facebook is not a place to connect people. Facebook is a place to give people positive interpersonal relationships. Zuckerberg talks a lot about connecting people. Facebook is not about connecting people. Facebook is about positive interpersonal relationships. Just remember that as you're going through some of the things that Zuckerberg says. From that perspective, that's why we generally try to refer to what we do as a platform for all ideas. Cruz, let me try this because time is constrained. It's just a simple question. The predicate for Section 230 immunity under the CDA is that you're a neutral public forum. Do you consider yourself a neutral public forum, or are you engaged in political speech, which is your right under the Second Amendment? Zuckerberg, our goal is not to engage in political speech. I am not familiar with the specific legal language of the blah, blah, blah. So Zuckerberg wants to be a neutral public forum, but he cannot commit himself to saying that Facebook is a neutral public forum. I think it's because that would subject him to regulation and legislation like that Ted Cruz is talking about, Section 203 immunity. He wants to be a neutral public forum, and he wants to engage in political speech, I think, is what's going on here. I think he wants to have his cake and eat it too, and that's why he's not committing to either of the phrases that Ted Cruz introduces in that dialogue. We'll skip down a little bit, and we'll go to this from Cruz. Your testimony says it is not enough that we just connect people. We have to make sure those connections are positive. We have a responsibility not just to build tools, but to make sure those tools are used for good. Do you feel it's your responsibility to assess users, whether they are good and positive connections or ones that those 15 to 20,000 people deem unacceptable or deplorable? Now that's a reference to the content reviewers that Zuckerberg has been talking about Facebook hiring. He references that a few times in the dialogue that he has with these senators, that Facebook is going to hire content reviewers. And Cruz is asking, is it good and positive? Is it your responsibility to assess the relationships that people are having based on what these content reviewers deem unacceptable? And Cruz makes clear, he's talking about Facebook, not Zuckerberg. And Zuckerberg says, I think there are a number of things we can all agree are clearly bad. He goes off on his list, his practice list, because he goes to this list every time they're talking about censorship. Cruz says, I'm talking about censorship. Zuckerberg, I think that you would probably agree that we should remove terrorist propaganda from the service. Cruz just asked you, Mark, if you feel it's your responsibility to assess users based on the content reviewer's perspective of whether or not they're having an acceptable relationship. And your default stance is, I think you would agree that we should remove terrorist propaganda from the service. It speaks to Zuckerberg's philosophy about Facebook and what it is meant to do, that his default defensive position is, I think you don't think we should have terrorism on the service. Now, I'm going to skip ahead. I don't want to get bogged down too much. I'm already a little bit deeper into this than I was kind of hoping at this point. Let's skip on to Senator Sass's dialogue with Zuckerberg. He's talking about the First Amendment and the way that tech companies are dealing with the First Amendment. He says, you're a private company, so you can make policies that may be less than First Amendment full spirit embracing in my view. I worry about a place when you go from violent groups to hate speech in a hurry. That's what we just observed. Remember, Ted Cruz said, is it your responsibility to assess users, whether they're having good and positive connections? And Zuckerberg said, I think you would probably agree that we should remove terrorist propaganda from the service. And Sass observes the same thing that we just observed, that his default position is to talk about, as soon as we start talking about hate speech, we need to remind people that we're keeping terrorism off of our platform, as if terrorism is a justification for removing hate speech from the platform. You may decide, or Facebook may decide, it needs to police a whole bunch of speech that I think America might be better off not having policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. And this is crucial. Sass says, can you define hate speech? Zuckerberg says, I think this is a really hard question, and I think it's one of the reasons why we struggle with it. There are certain definitions that we have around, calling for violence. When Zuckerberg thinks of hate speech, he thinks of terrorism and calling for violence. Zuckerberg, in his own mind, has fully conflated terrorism and violence with hate speech. We talked about it a little bit earlier. We talked about the conflation of harmful words, and words that might hurt somebody's feelings with actions that can cause bodily harm. And Zuckerberg, it appears, has done the exact same thing in his mind. So this is the mentality of the guy that is running the most powerful social media network on the internet. In Zuckerberg's mind, words are the same as actions. I want you to realize this, because this is the state of mind in which he is governing Facebook. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip on down to the House testimony. This is an exchange between Steve Scalise, the congressman who was wounded in an assault on his and other Republican congressmen's life. Steve Scalise asks about... here's the question. The two questions that he asks. Was there a directive to put bias in? Are you aware of this bias that many people have looked at and analyzed and seen? Now, the bias that he's speaking about, we'll go back and read this. I want to ask you about a study that was done dealing with the algorithm that Facebook uses to describe what is fed to people through the news feed. What they found was, after this new algorithm was implemented, that there was a tremendous bias against conservative news and content and a favorable bias toward liberal content. If you look at that, it shows a 16-point disparity, which is concerning. I would imagine that you're not going to want to share the algorithm with us. I'd encourage you if you wanted to do that. But who develops the algorithm? Was there a directive to put bias in? And the only question that Zuckerberg gets to answer is that question. He says there is absolutely no directive. And then there's some crosstalk. Scalise goes off, interrupts him, talks about other different things. And then he talks about Cambridge Analytica, which we're going to visit briefly here before we go back. And then he goes off onto a different topic. Steve Scalise talks about Cambridge Analytica. He quotes one of the heads of Obama's digital team. Here's the quote. Facebook was surprised we were able to suck out the whole social graph, but they didn't stop us once they realized that was what we were doing. They came to the office in the days following the election recruiting and were very candid that they allowed us to do things they wouldn't have allowed someone else to do because they were on our side. Zuckerberg says, Congressman, we didn't allow the Obama campaign to do anything that any developer on the platform wouldn't have been able to do. So when Zuckerberg says what Obama did was okay and what Cambridge Analytica did was different, there might be some truth to that. If the Obama campaign purchased the user's data from Facebook, that appears to be okay. Zuckerberg doesn't have a problem with a third party, with the user being the first party, Facebook being the second party, and an app developer being the third party. He doesn't seem to have a problem with a third party buying your data from Facebook. What he does seem to have a problem with is what I would call a fourth party, a individual or company or whatever buying your information from a third party. That seems to be what he has a problem with. Now, the question that Zuckerberg didn't get to answer is, are you aware of the bias that many people have looked at and analyzed and seen? And I want to talk about that for a moment. This will be the last thing that we talk about. This video is going to reach the 30-minute mark. The left holds many beliefs that they believe to be self-evident, like hate speech. They believe that contesting these things is a hateful and dangerous act. These leftists are now writing the algorithms that run Facebook. That means that conservatives, or just anyone who disagrees with core tenets of leftism, for instance, anybody that argues whether or not hate speech exists, is going to run afoul of the algorithm. So it's not the directive. I think Zuckerberg is right, is telling the truth when he says there's not a directive to put leftist bias in. The directive is not the problem. The philosophy behind the elements of the algorithm are the problem. The philosophy that says hate speech exists and we need to police it is the problem. Because anybody that believes hate speech exists already has a left-wing bias. And that left-wing bias is then going to get programmed into the algorithm. We could talk about numerous different things. Hate speech just happens to be one that's been talked about several times in this dialogue so far. Now, I said we were going to hit the 30-minute mark, but I think I would just be repeating myself over and over again if I kept pushing it. So I'm going to say thank you all for watching. Thank you for joining me on this video. I do, again, apologize for missing yesterday, but I just don't think that the time that I had to research this topic was adequate yesterday. I'm much more pleased with the video I was able to bring you today. I hope that you enjoyed. Leave a like if you did. Hit subscribe and hit the bell for notifications if you would like to see more content like this in the future. I'll be doing videos every weekday that I can, and it's as I've said previously, my schedule is getting a little hectic. I don't know for how consistently I'll be able to upload videos on a daily basis. I'm fairly certain that my upload schedule is going to be changing in the near future, so keep watching so that you don't miss those announcements as they come down the pike. Again, thank you for watching. I hope that you'll come back and join me tomorrow. Until then, good night and God bless.